Hey everybody, Ralph here. This debate over transgender athletes in sports, it's one of the most heated discussions going on today. Some say that science has settled the question, others argue that it's more complicated. But what does the actual research say? Today, we're going to critically examine two major studies, and we ask the question of, are trans women at an athletic disadvantage, as some claim, or do advantages persist? This question matters because it impacts fairness, inclusion, and policymaking for thousands of athletes worldwide. So let's break it down this week. And the reason I'm posting this video, and I thought to post it, the Facebook page Mama Bears posted a viral statement claiming that the latest science proves that trans women have no athletic advantage over cisgender women. That claim is allegedly based on a 2023 review and a 2024 IOC, International Olympic Committee funded study. But does the data actually support that conclusion? Let's investigate that. To be fair, before we go over the studies, let's start by reading through the Facebook post in full from Mama Bears. And this is, as I understand it, an LGBT plus supporting organization. And this is how their post goes. Recent research continues to shed light on the participation of transgender athletes in sports. A comprehensive 2023 review by Assistant Professor DJ Oberlin at Lehman College examined the impact of gender-affirming hormone therapy on athletic performance. Now, this term comprehensive review, normally this has a specific meaning and it applies here. Typically in research, we talk about literature reviews, also sometimes called comprehensive reviews, and then we talk about systematic reviews. A literature or a comprehensive review brings together information on a topic in order to provide an overview of the available literature on a certain subject. A systematic review looks at a topic more in depth using a scientific method. Now, typically, a systematic review will go into the depth of what we call gray literature, but I won't get into that too much detail right here, but you can Google it if you want more. It appears accurate to say that the Oberlin article is not a systematic review, but rather a comprehensive or a narrative review of existing research on transgender athletes. This post did not get that wrong. I just wanted to clarify what that means. The article does not outline, that is, the article by Oberlin does not outline specific inclusion or exclusion criteria for the studies. Systematic review would have flowcharts or protocols that would explain how they chose the specific studies that they studied. The review summarizes some findings, but it doesn't conduct this sort of formal analysis that you'd see in a systematic review. All right, I'm getting into too much weeds right there. In short, it's a comprehensive survey of existing research, or at least Oberlin would have us believe that, but it doesn't necessarily have the bias minimizing methodology that we would like to see. Reading more, Oberlin concluded that an individual's sex does not determine their success or failure at any athletic event despite the high level of competition. This on its own is a strange thing to say, or at least a strange thing to say that Oberlin concluded it. Certainly it's one of the many sentences in the conclusion section, but it's so obvious that it seems not worthy of even attributing it to Oberlin. An individual's success or failure at a specific athletic event is completely unpredictable. Even the best athlete has their bad days. But yes, I suppose I do agree with the statement. Reading more, the study also noted there are great variations among cisgendered athletes, such as differences in height, weight, training, and more. Of course, that's true. That means in the general population, there are bound to be people that are better at some sports than others, but no one seems to worry about those. Okay. It is expected that about 2.3% of a normally distributed population is likely to fall above 2 standard deviations from population mean. Oberlin explained. This is an interesting piece. It's worthy of a comment. First of all, of course, there are great variations. The comment that nobody seems to worry about those seems a little strange to me. Kind of that's the point of sports in many ways, is specifically to identify those who are better than others. That perhaps that's what the author of this Facebook post is getting at. But in any case, I suppose gendered or sex divided sports don't need to be a thing that could address that issue. Yet they are. And why are they? I don't know, but I could see a justification being in part that it's due to physical safety, in part due to performance and support of those, particularly women in physical sports, who would never be able to shine when there are these stark physiological differences between the average man and the average woman, in which I mean those who are near the center of the normal distribution. And speaking of normal distribution, this comment here about 2.3% being above two standard deviations let you know something that's always true. That's how a normal distribution works. About 2.5% on the top and on the bottom are outside of the two standard deviation range. So anyway, there are indeed outliers. Of course, that's true. But reading on, these exceptional individuals may be those who are gifted and excel at some sport or athletic performance. In 2024, the idea that trans women athletes have an inherent advantage over cis athletes was once again undercut by a study funded by the International Olympic Committee and conducted at the University of Brighton in England. It was published in April in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. We will take a look at what that study found as well, but let's see what the Facebook post goes on to say. That study found transgender women performed worse than cisgendered women in tests measuring lower body strength. Transgender women performed worse than cisgender women in tests measuring lung function. Transgender women had a higher percentage of fat mass, lower fat-free mass, and weaker hand grip strength compared to cisgender men. Transgender women's bone density was found to be equivalent to that of cisgender women, which is linked to muscle strength. And this begs the question for me then whether transgender men would have an unfair advantage over cisgender men in sports where lower body strength, lung function, fat and fat-free mass, and hand grip strength matter. But anyway, reading on, another common myth is the idea that boys or men might falsely claim a female identity just to compete in women's sports. However, there is no evidence to support this claim. Transitioning is a deeply personal and often difficult process, not something athletes would do just to win a competition. The reality is that trans athletes, like all athletes, just want a fair chance to compete in the sports they love. And certainly, my inclusive side says, heck yes, we want anyone who wants to compete to be able to compete. Reading further, therefore, science tells us, after hormone therapy, trans women's athletic performance aligns more closely with cisgender women. Competitive advantage is complex and influenced by many factors, including training skill and individual physiology, not just gender identity. And transgender women are likely to be at a physical disadvantage compared to cisgender athletes. These are intriguing claims. The statement that the trans woman's performance aligns more closely with cisgender women, that sounds a little ambiguous to me. More closely than what? Is it more closely than it was aligned before? If so, yes, that's obvious. Or are you specifically saying that it now more closely aligns to a cisgender man than a cisgender woman, or rather closer to a cisgender woman than to a cisgender man? I think that's the implication that the poster here is trying to say. I don't know if that's truth. I'd be interested in research on that. Of course, we agree that gender identity is not the only factor in competitive advantage. And then this statement here that transgender women are likely to be at a physical disadvantage compared to cisgender athletes. I don't think that was supported by what completely anyway by what was said in the post. I see some vague statements that could suggest that there might be some disadvantages, but there are also some clear advantages. No, I guess we'll see when we look into this research. The interpretation from Mama Bears here aligns with some of the aspects in the Oberlin article, but I think it contains some inaccuracies. I'm linking to not just the Mama Bears website, just to be fair to them, and to, if I can, I'll link to their Facebook post on this, but I'll also link to the full Oberlin article. You should check it out for yourself. That's important. But I'll highlight some things. It's certainly true that the article does say a lot of things that this Facebook post mentions. Says that there's a wide variation of people. Obviously, that's true. 2.3% are above the two standard deviations from the mean. Obviously, that's true. That's just a statistical thing that happens with normal distributions. There is some mention of gender-affirming hormone therapy altering physical attributes over time. That's, of course, unsurprising. And there's an acknowledgement that some attributes, like height and limb length, well, they're going to remain unchanged, while others, like muscle mass, aerobic capacity, there is a movement toward alignment with the cisgender counterpart of the same gender identity. That's interesting and that's important. The article doesn't find any credible evidence that men falsely claim a female identity for competitive advantage. So all of that seems to be true, those things that Mama Bears claims. Then there's some inaccuracies or at least overgeneralizations. The statement, an individual's sex doesn't determine their success or failure at an athletic event, despite the high level of competition. That's a little misleading, as I mentioned before. The article doesn't deny that there are sex-based athletic differences, but it argues that post-transition transgender women's performance moves towards the cisgender female norms, right? But of course, it's true that in an individual case, we're not going to be able to say what's going to happen in every individual case. Oberlin acknowledges that transgender women, even after hormone therapy, might retain some physical advantages in certain metrics. This is important because, of course, it is the case that women are better than men at some things, that women who have not undergone hormone therapy might be better than a man who has at some things. But there are physical advantages that remain for the man and the trans woman over the cisgender woman that aren't explained away in this article, and that are still there and that are still worthy of discussion. I don't think that it's the end all be all for the conversation about whether trans athletes should be in the cisgender matching their gender identity portion of that sport, but I think it's worthy of discussion. The interpretation from Mama Bear says that transgender women are likely to be at a physical disadvantage compared to cisgender athletes. That's not fully supported by Oberlin's review either. Oberlin states that some performance metrics, especially strength, may remain above the cisgender female averages, even after 2 years of hormone therapy. Now, there are going to be some attributes that decrease endurance. Others, though, like grip strength, they're going to remain pretty high. And that's a nuance that this summary from Mama Bears overlooks. The article discusses how some aspects of physicality, body composition, grip strength, limb proportions, they're not going to fully align with the cisgender female averages after transition. So we need to acknowledge those complexities in order for us to make it possibly sound as far as our interpretation, and also make it so it doesn't sound as though we're saying that all the advantages that matter disappear. Now, then there's the International Olympic Committee funded study. Now, the interpretation cites that study, but of course, there's no citation in the Oberlin study to it because the Olympic Committee study came later, right? And there's no direct connection here between the Oberlin findings and the IOC study findings. So let's look at that IOC study. Again, I'm linking that in the description. You should definitely read it. The study provides some important empirical data regarding athletic performance of transgender athletes compared to their cisgender counterparts. It does support a lot of what Mama Bear's claims. Transgender women performing worse than cisgender women in lower body strength tests. Yes, there was some evidence of that. There was some evidence of transgender women performing worse than cisgender women in lung function tests. There was some evidence that transgender women had a higher percentage of fat mass, lower fat-free mass, and weaker hand grip strength compared to cisgender men, not cisgender women, which is, again, not a really surprising outcome. Transgender women's bone density was equivalent to that of cisgender women, and there was support for the idea that competitive advantage is complex, and things aren't just based on gender identity, which of course we already knew. But there are some oversimplifications in Mama Bear's interpretation here as well. Mama Bear says that after hormone therapy, trans women's athletic performance aligns more closely with cisgender women. Again, I said earlier, I think that's a little bit ambiguous, but looking at the IOC study, some aspects of a transgender woman's performance, or rather transgender women's performance, aligned more closely with cisgender women, but there were some key physical advantages that persisted. The hand grip strength issue, the height issue and body mass issue, and also absolute peak power and absolute VO2, oxygen max. Mama Bear says transgender women are likely to be a physical disadvantage compared to cisgender athletes. That's a little misleading as well. The study showed that transgender women had disadvantages in some areas, but they retained advantages in others. As I've said, I feel like I'm repeating myself here. The interpretation by Mama Bears seems to imply an overall disadvantage, but the studies here, it's a mixed outcome of both advantages and both disadvantages and retained advantages. And then Mama Bear says the idea that trans women athletes have an inherent advantage over cis athletes was once again undercut. Not really supported for basically the reasons that I've said. The study doesn't conclude that transgender women lack advantages, but rather calls for a sport-specific analysis rather than a blanket ban. So there's appropriate caution against the outright bans, but it doesn't argue that all the competitive advantage is erased, right? So the study doesn't support sweeping conclusions about transgender women being at a universal disadvantage. It doesn't fully negate concerns about retained advantages. It calls for sport-specific evaluations, right? Based on these two papers, the Oberlin Review and the IOC-funded study, which is under the author name Hamilton, independent of what Mama Bears has posted here, let's look at some of the physical and mental fairness issues here. The key findings from the studies: trans women retain higher hand grip strength even after hormone therapy. They had lower VO2 max and jump height. They had higher fat mass, but retained greater height and body size. No significant difference on bone density after the hormone therapy between trans women and cis women. And trans women had worse lung function metrics like FEV1 and FEC than cis women. So look at this chart here that I've got created based on what these studies say. If we look at different types of sports and we look at the findings that come from this, you can screenshot this if you want to. Essentially, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the impact of the trans women's physiology as found in these studies as compared to cisgender women and saying, is there a fairness concern here with a transgender woman competing against a cisgender woman? And what we see is in endurance sports like running, cycling, and swimming, mostly fair. There are some advantages in body mechanics, but these aren't strength exercises, right? And strength, power, overall power is really where that big advantage lies for men and trans women over cisgendered women. So for endurance sports, it's possible that in many or all of them that there's not going to be a big fight there about allowing trans women to compete with other women. In strength and power sports, though, like weightlifting, shot put, and wrestling, it's a fairly clear competitive advantage that I think most would say is unfair. It just puts those trans women, because of um, their biology, much further ahead than the cis women. In combat sports, you might see a lot of that as well, and or rather, you probably see a lot of that, and a higher risk of it, and a real risk of safety concerns, since those are the sports where you're actually hitting on each other, right? In team sports, you're going to see some retained advantages, but it's not overwhelming, right? And for precision and skill-based sports like archery, golf, those are areas where there's not really any major advantage. It seems like mental skill and practice and precision that's what matters there. So you can see that on a spectrum from precision skills to endurance sports to team sports to strength sports to combat sports, you see an increasing, as you go along that continuum, increasing divide and competitive advantage and safety concern. But at the start of that spectrum, there really aren't as many concerns, right? So the let's see, jump ahead a little bit in my notes here. Uh, Also looked a little bit at the reverse, which is the trans men, female to male, competing against cisgendered men. And there was some support in the studies that might support this table as well. We're looking at the same sport types. Again, at the bottom, the precision and skill-based sports, we're not really worried too much about that. At this, and but what's interesting here is the unfair advantage really leans away from the strength issue, right? Which is, I guess, not surprising, because a trans woman has a strength advantage over a cis woman. And so a trans man, well, I don't know. I don't know if I understand that particular dynamic, but I guess because the testosterone that comes in through that hormone therapy to go to be a trans man, that increases your muscle mass and your strength. And so that's going to be an issue. Still, the trans man is not going on average to be able to perform as well at strength and power sports as the cisgender man. So there's a disadvantage that kind of goes the opposite direction. And, we also see that same disadvantage definitely in endurance sports. So again, if this is a spectrum here from fair to unfair disadvantage and maybe even safety concerns. Now, there are maybe some policy implications here. As I said, you think about sport-specific regulations. One-size-fits-all approach is pretty unscientific here. Different sports have different demands. Fairness has to be evaluated per sport, right? There might be some time-based transition criteria, right? Strength-based sports might require a longer transition period before competition. Then there's fairness and inclusion, balancing those two, ensuring that fairness in high impact sports shouldn't come at the cost of unnecessary exclusions in sports if the advantages are not persisting, right? And then, of course, we need some more study here, right? Most of the data here are snapshots in time. We call that cross-sectional data. We need some more research there that tracks performance changes over years of transition. The real issue here isn't whether trans women should compete, but whether the one-size-fits-all interpretation of science helps us make fair and just decisions. If we accept an oversimplified version of this research, which is what you get in the Mama Bears posting, I would argue, we risk making decisions that have unintended and maybe even harmful consequences, right? Now, we have in combat sports, The things like the size, the bone structure, the muscle density, those things matter for safety. And if the strength differences remain, allowing trans women to compete against cis women could create unfair and potentially dangerous conditions. Overstating scientific findings, like Mama Bears does, I argue, erodes public trust in fair policy making. So we shouldn't let those things go viral. When people see a mismatch between policy claims and reality, it's going to reinforce some skepticism. It's going to fuel more restrictive policies. It's going to fuel more backlash, folks, rather than evidence-based policies. There's also the factor here about female athletes who might feel unheard when their concerns about fairness are dismissed. Instead of promoting inclusivity, forcing a blanket interpretation fuels resentment, and it can widen social divides. Yeah, there are several arguments for and against the creation of trans sports leagues, for example, as a potential solution to this fairness and inclusion debate. That's certainly a possible outcome here. One of the biggest concerns in sports is balancing fair competition with inclusion. So a trans-specific league could remove debates over this sort of stuff. But it's also a concern because it's a segregation concern, essentially, right? This is like separate but equal all over again. You also have an insufficient athlete pool, right? There's just transgender athletes generally making up a small percentage of the population. Would there even be enough participants to create competitive leagues across multiple sports? And there might be lack of funding issues and things of that nature. So again, I think that we can find some middle ground solutions here, might create open divisions, those sorts of things. Moving on to kind of a final piece here, I think, that relates more to morality and faith. I think that we have to move forward on issues like this in a way that balances fairness, inclusion, and moral values. My faith teaches that we're called to justice and compassion, but also to truth and wisdom in our decision making. Emphasizing God's justice is what we should be doing, if you're a Christian anyway. And that means ensuring fairness for all, not just one group. It means welcoming trans athletes, but also preserving fair competition for cis women. The verse at Micah 6:8 says, "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Acting justly here means seeking fairness for both trans and cis athletes. Loving mercy means ensuring that trans people are not excluded unjustly. And walking humbly means admitting we don't have all the answers, but we strive for policies that work for everyone. It's also true that not all sports are the same. What's fair in golf might not be fair in wrestling. So we need to evaluate based on each sport's demands, right? We need to look at those things closely to discern. We need to listen, right? We need to act slowly. These are, in fact, a Christ-centered ethic. James 1:19 says, "Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry." This culture war that's going on right now, it's leading to division. It's largely based in division, right? Instead of defending sides here, we got to listen. Listen to these trans athletes, the female athletes, the scientists, the theologians, and be discerning and be willing to say that it's different for each kind of sport. And that's how we find a better path forward. We've got to advocate for some more research, not just policy that's based on incomplete data. Our role is not to twist the facts to fit ideology, but to use wisdom and discernment so that we can find solutions that honor everyone. Now, before we wrap up, here are 3 things that you can do today to help address this issue or equip yourself for conversations about trans athletes in sports. Number 1, read the research for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Go to the resources. We've got Oberlin's 2023 review and the Hamilton or IOC-funded 2024 study linked in the description. Look for nuance. What does the data actually say versus how people are interpreting it? If we want fair policies, we have to have accurate facts, not just sound bites. So your action step is read those studies or find another peer-reviewed study on trans athletes and read at least the abstract and conclusion. You can start a Google Scholar if you don't have access to the paid databases. Number 2, approach conversations with a justice-minded Christian perspective. Instead of taking a cultural war approach, think about fairness and truth and compassion. Remember James 1:19, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. Most people don't read the science. They bring opinions. You can bring facts. When someone says trans women have no advantage or trans athletes should be banned, you can ask, well, does the data say that? What does the data say? What kind of fairness are we talking about exactly? And how would we apply this in a way that honors inclusion and competition integrity? The next time this comes up, commit to listening first before responding. And 3, support science-based sport-specific policies. If we truly care about fairness, we've got to support nuanced sport-by-sport policies. Advocate for decisions based on research, not ideology. Support organizations that are studying this issue honestly, rather than those just pushing political agendas. Write or call a governing body, a sports governing body like the IOC or the NCAA. Ask them how they are incorporating science into their policies. That's your challenge for today. Read the research, have better conversations, and advocate for fair policies that balance inclusion and competition integrity. You know, if we all did these things, we'd have a much healthier, more productive discussion about this issue. And if you found this helpful, I ask you, like, subscribe, and share this video. Let me know in the comments. What was helpful to you? What's one thing maybe that you learned today that changed your perspective? Or what's something that I got wrong? Let me know. Thanks for watching.